Has anyone ever been to a wedding that didn't end with a couple getting married? If so, what happened? How did the guests react? I haven't been an official guest at a dramatic wedding, but I did witness one. I was selling my services as a videographer and was booked to tape a choral performance at a local church. I always arrived early to set things up, and on this day, I discovered the church was previously reserved for a wedding, so I had to wait for the service to finish. It seemed like a typical ceremony. The organ music started and the procession began. Everything seemed normal, until the bride entered. She was a tall, large woman, possibly in her 20s or 30s, and she walked down the aisle alone, which I found unusual. The ceremony began and a man in the audience stood up and shouted, "You still have time!" He was quickly shushed, but his words had an impact. The groom raised his hand, the priest stopped, and though I couldn't see the bride's face, I could hear her angrily whispering to her fiancé. "Excuse me," the groom said. "I'm sorry." He continued after a pause. He spoke to the bride and the best man, then fainted. I thought it was a medical issue, but I was wrong. The best man picked up the groom and walked down the aisle without saying a word. The bride yelled, "I hate you all!" and stormed off. No one followed her. The man who had spoken up earlier stood again and said, "I'm sorry for wasting everyone's time. You're all still welcome to come to the reception." People started to leave, whispering among themselves. I learned that the bride had pressured the groom into marriage, believing it would change his orientation. Some said the groom wasn't actually gay, but had used that as an excuse to end the relationship with his girlfriend. I felt like being in the middle of a soap opera's finale. I regretted not filming the event. Well, that would have gone viral. Story 2. This story took place in Kolkata, India, where my dad attended. The couple had been introduced to each other and, after about 6 months of dating, got engaged. They'd known each other for almost a year by this point. These are well-off people from the upper income range, not from a village. There were events the day before the wedding ceremony, which over 500 people attended, and of course, people talked, so word got out. On the evening of the wedding, a group of people showed up and blocked the street, preventing the groom from reaching the venue. All the while, the groom had been dating a woman from another family under the promise of marriage. He had even introduced himself to her parents and family, planning a future meeting between his parents and hers. Mind you, all the guests had arrived and heard this. For about an hour, there was a standoff, and the information reached the bride and her family, who called off the wedding. The guests were half in shock, half trying to eat and drink as much as they could before the inevitable cancellation. The bride's family took the matter to court, and the groom settled out of court with them. The bride and her parents personally returned all the gifts they had received. My dad didn't allow them to return his gift and told her to keep it, considering the circumstances. In another story, my best friend was getting married to someone I didn't think he should. I advised against it, and his family did too. After I moved away, I think he just wanted something. Anyway, she showed up intoxicated at her own wedding. Her family tried to sober her up without the groom noticing by having her rest and taking pills. Keep in mind, my buddy is a very straight-laced guy who rarely drinks. Throughout the lead up to the ceremony, I had to stop her 3 different mothers from sneaking her old bottles of drinks. She managed to keep it together enough that maybe some people in the back couldn't tell she was absolutely hammered, but I'm pretty sure most people knew. In all their wedding photos, her eyes are half closed or almost cross-eyed. Fast forward, she became a major drinker. Tried breastfeeding their child while intoxicated and hid things in the house. She spent so much on drinks that he took away her credit card, leading her to steal booze from stores. He sent her to a hospital where she met a user who got her back into her old habits. She also started a relationship with him. They left and went on a crime spree involving theft, reckless behavior like sudden braking at high speeds, living in a car, trading her car for some powder. He now has custody of their child and her child from the previous relationship. He's a really good guy and very smart. This just shows how blinded you can be in certain situations. This wedding shouldn't have happened, and I like to think it didn't in an alternate timeline. Story 3. I have a perfect example. I used to work with a girl named Ashley. She worked in my office a couple of desks down. She was engaged to someone I never met. He traveled a lot for work, or so I was told. We became close friends, and a few of us were invited to the wedding. Ashley's coworkers threw her a party the weekend before the wedding. I went and had a great time. I had no idea what would happen next. A couple of days before the wedding, while at work, I heard coworkers talking loudly about something terrible. I went over to find out what was going on and learned Ashley had called off the wedding. Family and friends from Utah had already flown in for it. It turned out the fiancé wasn't a good person. He had no job and was stealing from her. She decided not to go through with the wedding. 3 months after the canceled wedding, Ashley and I started dating. She told me later she had doubts about the marriage and feelings for me, which I didn't realize I shared until after the ordeal. We've been married for 5 years now and have a son together. When people ask how we met, we leave that story out. On another occasion, during the "do you take this man" part of my brother's wedding, his sister-in-law just stood there, silent, for about 3 minutes. She had a deer in the headlights look. The minister asked her mom to join her and told everyone to be patient, saying it was just wedding jitters. My brother looked stunned. He sat down, put his head between his knees, and tried not to pass out. After nearly half an hour and several checks by the minister, my sister-in-law and her mom returned. The ceremony restarted from the beginning, with the bride walking down the aisle again. She cried through most of the ceremony, but they got through it. We later learned that a close family friend's husband had passed away that morning after a long battle with an illness, leaving a widow in her early 40s. It hit my sister-in-law hard because the neighbor had been like a second mother to her. The grief and the realization that marriage means someone will eventually lose their loved one overwhelmed her. They're still married, with 3 kids, a dog, and a house in the suburbs, but there was a touch-and-go moment for about half an hour. In a separate story, I was the best man at my friend's wedding to a woman who was a bit unstable. The wedding was in an old house in the staircase landing. The groom and I heard her upstairs, telling her dad she didn't want to go through with it. He basically told her there were 100 people waiting, so she had to do it. And she did. I don't know why my friend didn't back out or get an annulment the next day. He somehow blocked that memory out. 7 years later, he spent over $100,000 in a custody battle, but now has sole custody of their child after her repeated displays of instability in front of a judge. Despite false allegations and the system's tendency to favor the mother, his persistence and willingness to sacrifice everything for his child paid off. The funny part was, when they divorced, he asked why I hadn't warned him. I reminded him of all the times I tried, and he finally remembered. Story 4. I worked at a catering company for a while. At a Hawaiian-themed wedding on the beach, the bride and the groom were holding hands at sunset. The officiant asked if anyone objected to their union, and a guy stood up from the back and said he did. People laughed, thinking it was a joke, but the guy was already walking down the aisle towards the families. The officiant thought it was a prank and was about to dismiss it. The guy whispered something to the groom's father and then the bride's father. Both families decided there would be a short delay. The bride, groom, immediate family, and the guy went inside the venue. 10 minutes later, a few cars left. I was busy at the bar on the deck, knowing people would want drinks regardless of the outcome. The bride's father came out and announced the wedding was off. But since the food and drinks were ready, everyone was welcome to stay and enjoy them. I never found out what the guy said or if the couple ever got married. However, there were enough leftovers of steak and lobster to feed my roommates and me like royalty for most of the week. Damn, bro. Way to give me blue balls on that one. Story 5. A guy I know, who's my brother's friend, married a girl from our hometown. She graduated a year after me, and he graduated 3 years before me. I knew her from riding the bus to school together in elementary school. The wedding went well, and everyone was happy. The reception was fine too, until the after party at a bar. The bride and groom were drinking, and when the groom wanted to leave, the bride refused and got too close to an older bartender. The groom, hammered and upset, left alone. It turned out she went home with the bartender and had been seeing him for months. She was 21 and he was 38. They obviously divorced. The next day, the groom went to the bar with a baseball bat. He called out the bartender and the police arrived. They sympathized with him but couldn't let him fight. They drove him home without charging him. The bride's mother sided with her daughter and her father sided with the groom. A month later, the bride's parents, married for 25 years, filed for divorce because of the incident. It shocked the whole town. She was a pretty girl who was unfaithful to a nice guy with an older bartender on her own wedding night. She left town and I haven't seen her since. In another story, I had a friend I don't talk to much anymore, but we're not on bad terms. We just drifted apart. I was deployed to Afghanistan and couldn't make his wedding, which I regret because it was crazy. He and his girlfriend dated for 5 years and were getting married. Everyone liked her. Educated, smart, and attractive. On his wedding day, he left his phone in a room where the wedding was taking place. He needed it to call his late cousin who was at the wedding. He found the bride-to-be with a friend of a bridesmaid in that room. They probably thought it wouldn't be used. He's not confrontational, he just gets upset and leaves. He left, furious, and on his way out called her a derogatory name loudly, silencing the room where guests were waiting. Mutual friends told me this story, and I believe it. My friend, the groom, packed her things in the garage and didn't let her back in the house. They lived together, but everything was in his name. She was decent enough to leave without causing legal trouble. She tried to explain and apologize, but he couldn't forgive or forget. He was devastated. Story 6. I attended a wedding where the groom backed out the night before the ceremony. The couple was religious and had been college sweethearts, planning to marry the summer after graduation before he went to grad school. The bride had been my roommate, and I remember the groom reading her Bible stories to tuck her in, with the door always open. The wedding was in her hometown, a few hours from college, so guests had already arrived and booked hotels. With the wedding and reception canceled, we spent the time at the local bar, discussing their relationship in detail since there was nothing else to do. The groom's family left early and the bride's family wasn't up for any celebration. As someone who liked the groom more, it was tough. but it was better he realized it would be a mistake rather than going alone with everyone's expectations. On another occasion, I went to a wedding in the early 90s in Torrance, California. It was my then-girlfriend's cousin's wedding, held at a small church with a reception at Alpine Village. We were in the pews with about 100 people when we heard yelling. After a few minutes, someone told us the wedding was canceled. We received no explanation, and I never found out what happened. However, we realized there was an open bar at the reception, already paid for, so we went there, along with some other guests, and enjoyed many drinks. After about an hour, the bride and groom showed up, indicating they had gotten married after all. The reception turnout was low since it was before the days of mobile phones, and many who left the church missed out on the open bar. That meant more drinks for those of us who stayed. Story 7. About a decade ago, I was present at a friend's wedding ceremony. We were gathered at the chapel, and it's customary for the bride to keep the groom waiting at the altar for a short while. As minutes ticked by, guests began to jest, with comments like, "Maybe she's having second thoughts," or "Could she be practicing her wedding kiss with the driver?" It was all in jest, and no one genuinely believed that cold feet were at play. However, as more time passed, the atmosphere shifted from playful to anxious. Attempts to contact the bride and her driver via cell phones were met with no response, until a man claiming to be a police officer answered the bride's phone. The driver had crashed the car, veering off the road and rolling down a slope. Both the bride and the driver were severely injured, but alive. They were being airlifted to a hospital. As I was informed, the marriage was later officiated at the hospital with only immediate family present, and a religious ceremony was held a few months afterward. Moving on to a different tale, my girlfriend and I met in Geneva, Switzerland, where we lived for a period. After a relatively brief courtship, we realized we were deeply in love and decided to marry. We drove downtown to the ETA Civil to submit our application. For 6 months, we found ourselves there weekly, initially to obtain a list of required documents and then to repeatedly plead our case. They insisted on one specific document, proof that our respective countries would recognize the marriage. When I reached out to my embassy, I was met with confusion and skepticism. No one seemed to know what I was talking about, and others had married there without such a document. I even consulted our Minister of Justice, but everyone insisted that the documents didn't exist, and, of course, we had to recognize the marriage. Despite our explanations, the ETA Civil remained adamant about the document. We were at a loss, and during one of our visits, when my girlfriend was moved to tears, the head manager remarked, "In America, people can decide to get married in a whim, like choosing between a movie and a wedding. But here in Switzerland, it's not like that. Those people on the bench, they've been waiting to marry for 5 years." Her words deeply upset us, and we firmly stated that it wasn't her place to dictate our marriage, as we had already made our decision. Story 8. A friend invited me to her cousin's wedding as her date. The ceremony seemed to go well, except the groom was fidgeting, looking around and wearing a hostile expression. I thought it was nerves. They said her vows, typical Protestant Christian words, with the addition of stomping a glass at the end. When the priest got to "I pronounce you," the groom didn't wait for the kiss the bride part. He grabbed the bride, turned them both to face the audience, and started yelling at her side of the aisle, claiming she was his now and they should never expect to see her again. The bride tried to protest or calm him down, but when she spoke, he backhanded her, knocking her off the stage. This happened in seconds, and everyone was stunned. As we began to react, the priest hit the groom in the face. The groom fell, and the audience was in chaos, yelling and pushing. The priest calmly tore up what I assume was their marriage certificate. He tried to calm things down, but it was chaotic and looked like it might turn into a fight. My friend and others helped the bride leave, and it tried to keep people away, not knowing who was on whose side, and covered their exit. Once outside, we got the bride into a car with her mom and my friend so they could leave, and I quickly went to my car. A few days later, I learned the groom was arrested for breaking into the bride's house with a weapon, trying to find her, and trashing her house. The marriage wasn't recorded, so the bride didn't have to get a divorce. I declined wedding invitations for some time after that. Story 9. As a videographer for weddings, I've witnessed many memorable moments. One such occasion was when I was hired for a standard Christian American wedding in a large church. I arrived 20 minutes early to set up and capture some establishing shots, anticipating any traffic delays. Another wedding was already in progress, so I discreetly set up my camera and tripod at the back of the church. Suddenly, a gasp broke the air as the bride dashed for a side door, her maid of honor in tow. The entire church fell into a stunned silence. The echo of her footsteps, the only sound as she departed. For a moment, everyone was frozen. The groom, the families, the priest, even the other wedding's photographer and videographer. Then the bride's father shouted in disbelief and chased after her, his wife close behind. I never learned the outcome of that situation, but for the next 10 minutes, an awkward tension filled the air as people waited to see if the ceremony would proceed. Eventually, the priest announced that everyone had to leave to accommodate the next wedding. The wedding party exited awkwardly as my wedding party waited outside. I lost sight of the groom amidst my own preparation, so I am unsure if he pursued the bride. It was a dramatic and unprecedented event. as most ceremony cancellations or disruptions are usually more discreet, occurring weeks or months in advance. In a different scenario, I was present at a wedding where the pastor refused to marry the couple because the groom hadn't memorized his vows. This pastor was renowned for his ceremonies, and as he didn't charge for his services, he required couples to complete a course and memorize part of their vows. The couple had fulfilled all their requirements, but the groom hadn't taken the memorization seriously. When it was his turn, he attempted to use a cheat sheet, which upset the pastor. After apologizing, the pastor left the ceremony. Many family members who had traveled from afar were understandably upset. However, no one blamed the pastor, as he had been clear about not marrying couples who didn't believe or prepared. The bride was visibly upset but held back tears, while the groom, in the back, was drunk and crying over his failure. In the end, the church contacted the pastor to perform the ceremony. The second service went smoothly, with the pastor making lighthearted remarks about the reconvening. Afterward, it seemed as if the first service had been forgotten, and the groom's forgotten vows were no longer a concern. The couple did get married, but they had to make it official in front of a judge a week later. Story 10. My wife and I are both clergy, as are our friends. We support each other at weddings, helping with setup or just being there for moral support, and the free food. The worst thing I've seen was a bride's grandmother passing away during the ceremony while in a wheelchair. The bride had her grandmother read something emotional about how much she loves her granddaughter. After finishing, she closed her eyes, seemingly moved to tears. She never opened them again. At first, the bride's mother thought the grandmother had fallen asleep. They wheeled her down the aisle during the recessional, not wanting to wake her. When they couldn't wake her for the post-wedding photos, chaos ensued. I learned about her passing before the guests did. A friend conducted the ceremony, pulled my wife and me aside, saying the reception might be canceled. Guests panicked when the ambulance arrived, and the bride couldn't take photos due to her tears ruining her makeup. On a positive note, the reception had an amazing taco bar. Moving on to a lighter tale, I was invited to a college friend's wedding. We were best friends in college but lost touch. I invited her to my wedding, so I think she felt obligated to invite me to hers. The wedding was on a Friday, about 2 hours from where I live. My husband and I took time off work and drove there. We hit traffic and got dressed at a rest stop. When we arrived, we saw a large group of well-dressed people leaving. My husband joked, "Are you sure the wedding is today?" I assured him it was. We looked for signs or directions, but ended up at the check-in desk, asking for the wedding's location. The woman gave us a confused look, asked for the names again, and called the manager over. The manager informed us the wedding had been canceled a month earlier. A shocked expression prompted the manager to apologize and try to explain. We thanked her, changed out of our wedding attire, and went miniature golfing instead. Haven't spoken to the girl since. Impromptu date night sounds romantic. Anyway, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos like this. Story 11. I'm a wedding photographer commissioned to cover a wedding in Thailand over 5 days. It included top-notch accommodations and all expenses paid, plus my normal rate. I had previously shot the couple's engagement in Southern California and rescheduled the wedding for the following year after it was postponed, as they paid half up front. Fast forward about 12 months, I prepared for an epic destination wedding. The couple was of mixed heritage, Middle Eastern and American and Japanese and American. I decided to have 2 separate ceremonies to honor their families traveling from abroad. There were about 30 attendees from around the world, not including myself, my assistant, and 2 videographers. We stayed in a private compound with villas on a small island, a 2-hour flight from Bangkok. The location was stunning. The guests were great and the accommodations were spectacular. Day 1. My assistant and I flew to Bangkok and met the couple for the first time since their engagement shoot. Everything was great. They even hosted us in their hotel so we could hang out for about 24 hours before their parents and siblings arrived. Day 2. We headed to the island, met the remaining guests, and checked into our grand villa. We were provided with motorbikes, fresh mangoes, and an open bar. It was like heaven. We had about 4 hours before a welcoming dinner where we were asked to provide light coverage, but more as guests ourselves. It's always nice to be treated this way by clients. After resting, unpacking, and mingling, the groom approached us for a formal creative meeting at 6:30 p.m. sharp by the pool. As 6:30 rolled around, we sat down to discuss the plan for the week. We received the schedule and some interesting creative requests. They wanted us to capture the real life, appreciating our art and vision, which sounded ideal for any commissioned artist. However, the way they spoke was strange. They became super metaphysical, deep, and quite frankly, a bit bizarre. At one point, the groom put his hand on my leg, closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and smiled, saying he loved our energy. It felt odd. They transformed into spiritual nutjobs, and it only got more intense. After the strange meeting, we left it off, had a beer by the pool, and went up for dinner. We were last to sit down, but it wasn't a big deal as the bride and groom were still in their suite. Everyone began chatting, eating appetizers, and having drinks. After 2 hours, the bride's parents whispered to each other with blank faces, walked over to the bride and groom's quarters, and everyone felt uncomfortable. We realized we had started the party without them. The maid of honor and best man assured everyone everything was fine, suggesting the couple might come out later for drinks. The bride's parents returned in good spirits and we carried on. Around 11 o'clock, feeling jet lagged, we waited for the bride and groom. When they finally came, everything was fine. Spirits were high and the bride thanked each guest, even including us in her heartfelt speech about how they met. The groom began to speak, seeming aloof, almost like someone with early stages of Alzheimer's. He thanked each of us with tears of joy, spending about 10 minutes in the first 10 people. It was getting really late, and the ceremony was the next day. The bride's father suggested he wrap it up so we could all get to bed, which upset the groom. He got angry, told the father he didn't appreciate that, dropped the mic, and stormed off. Everyone felt what we felt at the earlier meeting, but brushed it off and settled into our rooms. Day 3. The schedule was relaxed, with the ceremony planned before sunset. The bride was getting ready with the bridesmaids, and the groom was with his best man. We were told to meet for breakfast at 10 a.m. to go over house rules. The manager was cool, just asking us to be nice, not break anything, and not flush anything but waste down the toilet due to old plumbing. It was short and sweet, but the groom interjected, upset the manager was being too serious, and stormed off. Despite the weird drama, we got great shots and had a good time when the groom wasn't around, but things got weird when he showed up. Everyone was afraid to talk, or just listen to his ramblings. Mostly metaphysical nonsense. He would rest his hand on someone and close his eyes for a minute or so, making things progressively more awkward. During the beach ceremony, everything went as planned until they exchanged rings. The groom removed his, walked to the ocean, and placed it in the water. After 10 minutes of confusion, the bride started crying. This wasn't part of the plan. We looked for the ring in the water, and the groom stood with his arms to the sky, but nothing happened. He walked back, and nobody knew what to do. The bride went to her room hysterically and was shot family portraits as scheduled. The most awkward photos ever. The reception proceeded without the bride and groom. They apologized later, saying they weren't used to the attention, and the groom had a nervous breakdown. Day 4. The second ceremony was scheduled, but we noticed furniture and decor scattered on the lawn. The groom had thrown everything out of their room, including lights, sheets, and furniture. He went berserk, according to the staff, but nobody else saw anything. We never saw him again. The bride's father had him removed from the property and the second wedding was canceled. We spent the rest of the trip hanging out with the guests, like a free vacation. After a few more days, I pieced things together. The groom was never a spiritual healer, he was a dentist. The only person who knew him besides the bride was his best man, who left before we could question him. Not a single guest, even the parents, had met him in person before us. The photographers. His wife didn't even know he was a dentist. To this day, I can't fully understand what happened. The best theory we have is that he either started or stopped taking medicine in Thailand, but he had to be crazy in general. It was bizarre. Story 12. My friend managed to get married with his best friend, but then she got into a car with some random guy. I was confused and asked my other friend what was happening. He explained that the guy was driving her to their honeymoon spot because she didn't like the way her new husband drove. 2 days later, I found out that once my friend reached the cabin for their honeymoon, he walked in on them in the shower together. She then revealed that she only married him to get her parents off her back, that she hated him, and was with this guy the whole week instead. They planned to tell everyone it wasn't working out once they got back and got an annulment. Her friend was devastated and never recovered. In another story, about 20 years ago, I, being Indian, was supposed to marry a close family friend. He was nice, but on the wedding day, he ran off with my younger sister. Yes, you read that right. He ran away with my sister. My entire family was upset and claimed his younger brother as compensation. I ended up marrying his younger brother. The marriage has been superb, like a dream marriage you see on TV, but yes, the marriage was an accident. On another occasion, I had a friend who called off the wedding that morning but still held the reception that evening. The bride's family didn't approve, so they didn't go through with it. Only those invited to the small ceremony knew, and many at the reception didn't. Guests were congratulating them, and the bride and groom just pretended they were married. They ended up getting married 4 months later in secret. The reception was awkward for those who knew. The couple is still together, as far as I know. They kind of went into hiding after the non-wedding. This didn't happen in the US, oddly enough. The bride was 19, so maybe she was afraid to stand up to her parents, or maybe she just wanted a happy wedding day. Story 13. My older brother married his girlfriend of 10 years. After the party, when most of us had left, it all fell apart. She and my brother's best friend had planned for 3 years to marry and then divorce so she could take the house and live there with a guy she was seeing behind my brother's back. She didn't know the house was in my dad's name, not my brother's. She was entitled to nothing. Last I heard, her family and boyfriend abandoned her after she gained weight. In another story, we went to the States for a wedding. Everything went well, and the day after we went to the government office for paperwork. The woman didn't know how to process her Canadian IDs, so we dealt with the department head. We filled out forms, signed, gave our address, and flew home a couple of days later. We waited for our paperwork, but it never arrived. I called, got the runaround for 20 minutes, and was told they had no record of us. When I asked what to do from another country, they had no ideas. We'll have to marry again, but I didn't want to marry in this city. It's weird. Never saw myself getting married, and now that I am, I'm not officially. On another occasion, I'm a wedding minister in Japan. I've overseen over 500 weddings, and there have been a few I thought wouldn't happen after rehearsals. It's usually an arrogant or absent-minded groom who seems oblivious, or a father disapproving of his daughter's choice. Just a month ago during a rehearsal, I had to ask the parents for approval. It's like giving away the bride, but both sides do it. I asked him and he needed a nudge from his wife before saying yes, looking at the floor. The groom, whom I thought was a complete idiot, didn't even notice. It was uncomfortable. During the actual ceremony, the father answered quicker but still looked at the floor and then began to cry. Story 14. My boyfriend was friends with a guy who was supposed to get married in another country. About 50 people had booked flights and accommodations. The night before the flight, they called off the wedding but insisted everyone go anyway, as most had used their vacation time. The bride and groom got hammered on the flight, which was weird for everyone, and spent their wedding night having dinner instead. They've been on and off ever since, but never married. Everyone still had a good vacation. In another story, I worked at a wedding where the couple broke up during the reception. It was on a building's roof with a small pool. The groom got intoxicated and pushed the bride, in her wedding gown, into the water. It was early in the reception. She stormed out and was taken home by a friend. Another story, not mine, but here it is. I was talking to a DJ who told me about a wedding he worked at. During the reception, it was time to have the cake. The groom put it into the bride's face and she was furious. She turned red, screamed at him, and hit him so hard it sounded like thunder, echoing through the hall. Everyone gasped and went quiet. She stormed off. Later, the bride's father gave the DJ $500. He said, "This marriage is over. She's left the building, but I've paid for this party and all my family and friends are here. I want you to finish the night strong. Keep the music playing and don't mention them again." The DJ agreed and everyone had a great time. Wedding turned into rave. Love it. Story 15. I was waiting for my bride-to-be who texted me that she wasn't feeling well and needed to go to the hospital. I grew suspicious when no one from her family showed up. It turned out they never sent their invitations and never told me the wedding was off. So there I was with my friends and family at a non-existent wedding. Moving on to another story, I know a guy who was supposed to marry his longtime girlfriend in Vegas. He flew there, friends flew there, but when he tried to fly, he was turned back at the border due to a bust operation. He had to call his girlfriend, telling her he couldn't make it and to enjoy the party. They got married once they returned to Canada. In a different story, my then girlfriend took me to a wedding where I knew no one. I was left with the groom and his party while she was a bridesmaid. The groom and his friends got hammered and bailed without telling anyone. I was the only one who knew the wedding wasn't happening. I had to go to the bride's room, explain the situation to my girlfriend, and we had to break the news. We broke up later and I lost contact with the bride and groom, so I don't know what happened after. Finally, I recall arriving late at a friend's wedding, carefully opening the door to avoid interrupting the ceremony. I walked in on an argument between the groom and his brother. The priest was trying to calm them down and the brother hit the priest, knocking him out. A brawl was because of the brother's shirt color. It was light blue, not white like everyone else's, and it upset the groom. Story 16. I knew a guy who bakes wedding cakes on the side. Once he got a call from a woman he vaguely knows, asking if he could make a cake for a wedding that weekend. He agreed. The bride ordered a cake with a bride and groom on top and another figure, a pregnant woman, off to the side. She was very specific about the pregnant woman's hair color and details. The wedding and reception went ahead. When they brought out the cake, everyone gathered around. People noticed the 3 figurines in the cake. The bride called attention to it, saying, "That's me, that's the groom, and this is the woman he got pregnant 6 months ago." Then she walked out. It's one of the craziest things I've ever heard. The lengths people go to for drama. Last I heard, the couple was still married. In another story, my sister-in-law and her husband are the sharpest tools in the shed. They planned the wedding for 2 years. On the day of the wedding, there was major highway construction causing detours between their house and the venue. We all arrived at the venue and met the priest, who asked for the marriage certificate. After a few minutes, they realized they'd forgotten it. The priest said they couldn't get married without it, so an uncle offered to drive back to their house, find the certificate, and bring it back. It took him about an hour and a half to return, only for the priest to say, "This isn't a marriage certificate, it's an application for one." My sister-in-law and her husband didn't realize they had to fill it out, apply, and pay for it. They thought they'd just give the application to the priest. The priest couldn't marry them, so the wedding turned into an exchange of vows promising to get married later. It was ridiculous. The next day, they actually got married at my in-laws' house. Story 17. I was driving on a semi-rural road past a large church on a chilly, windy, rainy day. The sky was gray and cloudy, so I was surprised to see a beautiful bride walking towards a vacant, muddy field near the church. The groom was trailing behind her by about 12 strides. At first, I thought they were taking photos, which seemed odd given the weather. Curious, I watched as the bride threw her veil to the ground and her dress dragged in the dirt. There were at least 200 cars parked in the lot, and suddenly, 4 of them raced through the road, about half a mile from the church. I watched for a bit before feeling awkward and leaving. I was curious about what had happened. When I got home, I searched online for any news but found nothing. Later, a customer at work who attended the church told me the story. It turned out the groom had been mistreating the bride's sister, and this came out just before the ceremony was to start. The bride ran from the church, and her family didn't know at the time. The image of her walking through that field on that gray day, in her gown, has always stayed with me. I often think about it and hope she's doing okay. Story 18. I worked on a yacht that specializes in weddings, probably working about 300 weddings in my lifetime. These events are booked months in advance, with non-refundable yacht reservations. The bride and groom split up about a month before the wedding. The groom, aware that people had traveled and he'd spent thousands on the yacht, food and alcohol, decided to throw a party instead. It was a groom with his groomsmen and many family male members having a frat-like party for hours. It was nice walking into work expecting to cater to a wedding and essentially becoming a nightclub bartender instead. On another story, a family I used to work for had a huge wedding for their daughter. They had to donate a lot of money to the city's largest church to hold the ceremony there. During the ceremony, one of the groomsmen passed out and hit the marble floor hard. Everyone stopped what they were doing to help the groomsman, leaving the bride and 2 friends at the altar. Luckily, she came from a showbiz family. After the initial shock, she said, "So, anyone here from out of town?" This got a laugh, and she entertained the crowd for a few minutes while they checked on the groomsmen. Everyone returned, and the priest was flustered. The bride said, "Let's start from the dearly beloved line." And they continued the ceremony. In a separate wedding, where my parents attended about 30 years ago where all the guests were seated, waiting for the groom to walk down the aisle. After a long wait, they decided to let the bride go first as the groom never appeared. No one was too concerned at this point as he was known for his jokes. Another 20 minutes passed. His parents, best men, and everyone but the guests were searching for him. Eventually, everyone was allowed into the reception hall to sit, chat, and watch TV. Some breaking news came on, reporting that a man in a black suit was on top of a building, considering jumping. And shortly after, he did. A couple of days later, it was confirmed that he was the groom, as everyone had suspected. I'm not sure what the bride's reaction was, but my mom says everyone was shocked and unsure of how to feel about the situation. Story 19. Friends of my girlfriend were getting married in Croatia, so we decided to attend. Most of the 300 guests were from the US. However, during our flight from the East Coast, there was a big fight. The wedding was called off. We still had a great time in Split, Croatia, but we wish the wedding had happened after spending the money to get there. In another story, my fiancé and I attended his coworker's wedding in June. We waited outside the church with the rest of the office group, but an hour later, we were told the bride had called off the wedding because she felt the bridesmaids were taking over. The wedding wasn't turning out as she wanted. The groom's mother invited us to the reception anyway, as everything was paid for, but it felt too awkward. So we went to Olive Garden instead. This experience led to a deep discussion, and we decided our wedding would be small and non-traditional. It's easy for such an important day to become about pleasing everyone else. At another wedding where my brother attended, the bride threw a lamp at the groom the night before, hitting him in the eye. This wasn't the first time something like this happened. They didn't get married the next day, but did so secretly later, despite my brother and his friends advising the groom to end the engagement. One story that involved me was when I almost walked out on marrying my now wife. I wasn't that into her and thought about the commitment and people's opinions, wondering how bad it would really be. It's not terrible. We have 3 kids, but I should have called it off and married someone else. I don't make enough for a divorce. I never found her very attractive or interesting, and I was just too lonely and single for too long, so I settled. Now she has health issues, has gained 80 pounds, and can't work. I'm not absolutely miserable, but I'm not really happy either. I realized I was angry at her for marrying me for years, but I had to let it go. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're gonna love this. Catch you in that video.